Elliot McKay had always believed that the world ran on small acts of kindness. A smile offered to a stranger, a helping hand for someone in need. These gestures, he thought, were the glue that held communities together. For 30 years, Elliot had driven the number 14 bus through the bustling streets and quiet neighborhoods of Riverbrook. His uniform was neatly pressed every morning, his shoes polished just enough to reflect the effort he put into his work. To Elliot, driving wasn't just a job. It was a chance to connect with people. Some passengers greeted him by name, sharing snippets of their lives during the ride. Others were quiet, their faces etched with fatigue or worry. Elliot respected both kinds, always offering a friendly nod and a soft good morning as they stepped onto his bus. One brisk autumn evening, the air crisp and tinged with the earthy scent of fallen leaves, Elliot noticed an elderly man standing at the bus stop near the library. The man was dressed in a heavy coat, his hands clutching a white cane that tapped rhythmically against the edge of the curb. He stood still, his face turned slightly upward as if listening for something. Elliot slowed the bus to a stop, watching the man carefully. He opened the door and leaned forward slightly. "Evening, sir. Can I help you aboard?" The man hesitated for a moment before nodding. "Thank you," he said, his voice soft but clear. He reached out tentatively, his cane sweeping the ground until it found the edge of the steps. Elliot stepped down and extended a hand. "No rush. Take your time." The man accepted the help, his fingers gripping Elliot's hand firmly as he climbed aboard. Once inside, he paused, his cane tapping lightly against the floor. "Where should I sit?" "Right here," Elliot said, guiding him to the priority seat near the front. "Nice and close." "My name's Elliot. What's yours?" "Harold," the man replied with a faint smile. "It's been years since I've been on a bus. The routes aren't easy to follow when you can't see." Elliot nodded, settling back into his seat. "Don't worry, Harold. Let me know where you're headed, and I'll make sure you get there." The bus rumbled back to life, merging onto the main road. Harold sat quietly, his hands resting on the head of his cane. As passengers got on and off, Elliot kept an eye on him, occasionally glancing back in the mirror. At each stop, Elliot asked, "Is this your street, Harold?" "No, not yet," Harold replied each time, his voice steady but tinged with uncertainty. The other passengers seemed to take notice. A young mother with a stroller offered a kind smile as she passed Harold's seat, and a pair of college students whispered among themselves, casting curious glances. One man, seated toward the middle of the bus, watched the interaction with particular interest. Dressed in a sharp coat and carrying a leather briefcase, he appeared to be in his early 40s, his eyes thoughtful as they flicked between Elliot and Harold. Eventually, Harold spoke. "Maple Street. That's where I need to get off." Elliot nodded, carefully pulling the bus to the curb. He turned off the engine and stood. "Let me help you down." "Oh, you don't have to," Harold said, though he made no effort to resist as Elliot offered his arm. "It's no trouble," Elliot replied, his voice kind but firm. "These steps can be tricky." As they stepped onto the sidewalk, the cool evening air wrapped around them. Harold hesitated, his cane sweeping the ground lightly, as if searching for something. "Which way from here?" Elliot asked. "Straight ahead. About 3 houses down," Harold said. "There's a mailbox with a sunflower painted on it." Elliot walked alongside him, his pace slow and measured. They passed the first house, then the second, until they reached a small home with a neatly trimmed hedge and the promised sunflower mailbox. Harold paused at the edge of the driveway, his posture relaxing slightly. "This is it," Harold said, his voice soft with relief. "Thank you, Elliot. You didn't have to go out of your way like this." Elliot smiled. "It's no trouble at all. I'm just glad I could help." Harold turned toward him, his expression earnest. "People don't often take the time these days. What you did tonight, it matters." Elliot nodded, feeling a warmth spread through his chest. "Take care of yourself, Harold. If you ever need a ride, you know where to find me." As Elliot walked back to the bus, he noticed the man with the briefcase still seated, his eyes following Elliot with quiet interest. Their gazes met briefly, but the man said nothing, offering only a small nod as Elliot resumed his seat and started the engine. The rest of the route was uneventful, though Elliot found his thoughts lingering on Harold. There was something about the interaction that stayed with him, a quiet sense of fulfillment that made the chilly evening air feel just a little warmer. When he returned home that night, Elliot made himself a simple dinner of scrambled eggs and toast. He sat by the window, watching the streetlights cast soft halos on the wet pavement, and thought about the elderly man with the white cane. Helping Harold had been a small thing, but to Elliot, it had been a reminder of why he loved his work. In a world that often felt rushed and impersonal, moments like this reminded him that kindness could still make all the difference. The following morning, Elliot's day started the same as it always did: a mug of tea with too much sugar, the quiet rustle of the city waking up outside his window, and the familiar walk to the depot. His mind kept drifting back to Harold, the gratitude in the man's voice, the gentle tap of his cane on the pavement. Elliot shook off the thoughts as he prepared for the day's route. The bus hummed to life, and the early morning passengers boarded in their usual flurry, carrying coffee cups and briefcases. It wasn't until his mid-morning break that Elliot noticed the envelope. It was resting on the dashboard, tucked neatly under the edge of the fare box. His name was written on it in neat, precise handwriting. Curious, Elliot opened it. Inside was a note. "Dear Elliot, I was on your bus last night and witnessed the kindness you showed to the elderly gentleman. It's rare to see someone go so far out of their way for another person these days. Your actions reminded me of something important, that even small acts can create ripples of goodness in the world. Please accept my gratitude for what you did. It may have seemed like nothing to you, but it meant a great deal to me and I'm sure to the man you helped. Sincerely, a fellow passenger." Elliot stared at the note, rereading the words as a faint warmth spread through his chest. He looked around the empty bus, as if expecting the sender to suddenly appear, but of course no one was there. The handwriting didn't look familiar, and there was no signature beyond the vague "a fellow passenger." As the day went on, Elliot couldn't stop thinking about the note. Who had written it? Was it the man with the briefcase? The thought lingered in his mind, and though he tried to dismiss it, he found himself scanning the faces of each passenger more closely than usual. By late afternoon, as the bus neared the library stop, Elliot caught sight of Harold once again. The elderly man was waiting patiently, his white cane tapping lightly at the curb. Elliot pulled over and opened the door, smiling as Harold stepped aboard. "Back so soon?" Harold chuckled. "I suppose I am. I had an appointment this morning and figured I'd take the bus again. Thought I might run into you." "Well, I'm glad you did," Elliot replied. "How've you been?" "Better, thanks to you," Harold said, settling into the same seat he'd occupied the night before. "It's not often someone takes the time like you did. It meant a lot." Elliot waved off the compliment. "It was no trouble, Harold, really." The ride was quieter this time, but as Harold prepared to disembark at his stop, he hesitated. "Elliot, do you mind walking me to my door again? I promise it won't become a habit," he added with a small laugh. "Of course," Elliot said, already standing. As they reached Harold's home, the older man paused at the gate, his expression thoughtful. "You know, you remind me of someone I used to know," Harold said softly. "He always said that kindness was the only thing worth giving away freely. You'd have gotten along." Elliot smiled. "Sounds like he was a good man." "He was," Harold said, gripping his cane tightly. "And so are you, Elliot. Thank you again." As Elliot returned to the bus, he noticed the same sharply dressed man from the night before seated near the front. The man looked up as Elliot stepped inside, his expression calm but curious. "You're quite the good Samaritan, aren't you?" the man said. Elliot shrugged, brushing off the remark as he settled back into his seat. Just doing my job. The man chuckled softly, standing as the bus approached his stop. Not everyone would see it that way. Keep it up, Elliot. You're doing more than you realize. Before Elliot could reply, the man exited, disappearing into the busy street. That night, Elliot sat at his kitchen table, the note from the mysterious passenger in one hand and a steaming cup of tea in the other. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was brewing, something he didn't quite understand yet. For now, though, he felt content, grateful for the quiet moments of connection that his work had brought him. The days passed, each one bringing Elliot a new mix of familiar faces and strangers. Harold became a semi-regular passenger, often catching the number 14 when he had appointments or errands. Each time, Elliot made sure to look out for him, helping him when needed and sharing brief, pleasant conversations. But the mystery of the note lingered. Who had left it, and why had they chosen to remain anonymous? Though Elliot wasn't one to dwell on things, he couldn't deny his curiosity. One evening, after his shift, Elliot returned to his bus to clean up and prepare it for the next day. As he swept the floor, he found another envelope tucked behind one of the seats. This one was addressed to the kind driver of the number 14. Elliot opened it with a mix of surprise and anticipation. Inside was another note. Dear Elliot, I've been watching the way you treat people on your bus, always with patience, respect, and genuine care. You may not realize it, but your actions have a ripple effect. You inspire others to be kinder, to slow down and see the people around them. I'd like to meet with you to discuss something important. If you're willing, please come to the cafe on Maple Street tomorrow at 6 p.m. I promise you won't regret it. Sincerely, a grateful passenger. Elliot reread the note several times, his thoughts spinning. It had to be the man with the briefcase. No one else had paid such close attention to him or Harold in recent days. But why would someone like him, a sharp-looking professional, want to meet with a simple bus driver? The next day, curiosity got the better of Elliot. After finishing his shift, he walked to the small cafe on Maple Street. The evening was cool, the sky streaked with the soft pinks and purples of sunset. As he entered, the warm scent of coffee and baked goods greeted him, and he spotted the man sitting at a corner table, a steaming mug in front of him. Elliot, the man said, standing to greet him. Thank you for coming. Please sit. Elliot hesitated briefly before taking the offered seat. You're the one who left the notes, aren't you? The man smiled. Guilty. My name is Michael Hart. He extended a hand, which Elliot shook cautiously. What's this about? Elliot asked, his tone polite but direct. Michael's expression softened. It's about recognizing the people who make a difference, even in the smallest ways. I've watched you go above and beyond for your passengers, especially Harold. You didn't have to help him the way you did, but you chose to, and that choice, it matters. Elliot shifted in his seat. I appreciate that, but I was just doing what anyone would do. Michael shook his head. That's where you're wrong. Not everyone would take the time. But you did, and it stuck with me. It made me realize how much we take people like you for granted, people who quietly make the world a better place. Elliot felt a flush of embarrassment. I'm not sure I've done anything worth all this attention. Michael chuckled. You're humble, which is another reason I wanted to talk to you. He took a sip of his coffee before continuing. I have a daughter, Sophie. She's 16, bright and full of life, but she's also been disabled since birth. She uses a wheelchair and needs help getting to her activities and appointments. Normally, I handle it myself or hire someone. But Sophie's been asking for something different. She wants someone she can trust, someone who feels more like family than just a driver. Elliot listened, unsure where this was going. I thought of you, Michael said simply. I know it's an unusual request, but I'd like to hire you to be Sophie's driver on the days you're not too busy with your usual work. The pay would be generous, and the schedule flexible. Most importantly, I think you'd make a positive impact on her life. Elliot blinked, taken aback. I don't know, Michael. I've never done anything like that before. Michael smiled. You've been helping people for 30 years, Elliot. Driving Sophie would be no different, it's just another way to care for someone. Elliot fell silent, his thoughts swirling. The idea felt daunting, but there was something about Michael's sincerity that made him consider it. Why me? Elliot finally asked. Because you're exactly the kind of person I want around my daughter, Michael said. Someone patient, kind, and steady. I'll leave the decision up to you, but I truly hope you'll say yes. Elliot nodded slowly. All right, I'll think about it. Michael smiled, sliding a card across the table. Take your time. Call me when you're ready. As Elliot walked home that evening, the quiet streets lit by soft street lamps, he found himself weighing the offer. It was an unexpected opportunity, and though he didn't know what his answer would be, he felt a small flicker of excitement at the thought of trying something new. Over the next few days, Elliot couldn't stop thinking about Michael's offer. Every time he turned it over in his mind, the same doubt surfaced. Could he really make a difference in someone's life beyond his usual work? He had always considered himself a simple man, someone content to do his job well and help where he could. But this was different. At the same time, he couldn't ignore the curiosity tugging at him. Sophie, Michael's daughter, sounded like a remarkable young woman. And Michael's faith in Elliot felt humbling in a way he hadn't experienced before. By the end of the week, Elliot made his decision. After finishing his evening shift, he pulled out Michael's card and dialed the number. Michael's heart came the familiar voice on the other end. Hi, it's Elliot, he said, a hint of nervousness in his tone. I've thought about your offer and I'd like to give it a try. Michael's response was immediate and warm. I'm glad to hear that, Elliot. Thank you. Let's meet tomorrow so I can introduce you to Sophie. The next morning, Michael picked Elliot up in a sleek but modest car. The drive to his home, a charming house on the outskirts of Riverbrook, was filled with easy conversation. Michael shared more about Sophie, her love of art, her sharp sense of humor, and her determination to live as independently as possible despite her challenges. When they arrived, Sophie was waiting by the front door in her wheelchair. She was petite, with long, dark hair pulled into a loose braid, and a pair of bright green eyes that seemed to sparkle with mischief. You must be Elliot, she said with a grin. Dad hasn't stopped talking about you. Elliot chuckled, shaking her hand. Nice to meet you, Sophie. I hear you're quite the artist. Flattery already, Sophie teased, her grin widening. You're going to do just fine. The three of them spent the morning together, with Michael explaining Sophie's schedule and needs. Sophie chimed in frequently, clearly eager to make Elliot feel comfortable. Most of the time, it's just rides to the community center or art classes, Sophie explained. I promise I'm not high maintenance. I don't doubt that, Elliot said, smiling. But you let me know if there's anything you need, okay? By the end of the visit, Elliot felt more at ease. Sophie's humor and warmth were infectious, and Michael's gratitude was evident in every word and gesture. They agreed Elliot would start the following week, working on days when his bus schedule allowed. Elliot's first day driving Sophie was a mix of nerves and excitement. She directed him to her favorite coffee shop before her art class, where they shared easy conversation over steaming mugs. So, what's it like driving a bus all day? Sophie asked, her tone curious. It's different every day, Elliot said. You meet all kinds of people. Some are in a rush, some are quiet, and some, like your dad, leave mystery notes. Sophie laughed, her eyes lighting up. That sounds like him. The more time Elliot spent with Sophie, the more he realized how much she reminded him of the passengers he'd connected with over the years, resilient, kind, and full of stories waiting to be shared. One afternoon, as they returned from an appointment, Sophie turned to him. You know, Elliot, I wasn't sure about this whole private driver thing. But I think you're exactly what I needed. You're good company. Elliot felt a warmth spread through his chest. Thanks, Sophie. That means a lot. As the weeks went by, Elliot fell into a rhythm. Balancing his shifts on the number 14 with his time driving Sophie became second nature. The pay was better than he'd expected, but it was the connection he'd formed with Sophie and Michael that truly mattered. Sophie's art classes soon turned into small showcases, and Elliot found himself attending as her honorary guest. Watching her beam with pride as people admired her work filled him with a sense of purpose he hadn't anticipated. One evening, after dropping Sophie off at home, Michael pulled Elliot aside. "I just wanted to thank you again," he said, his voice sincere. "Sophie's been happier these past few weeks than she's been in months. You've made a real difference, Elliot." Elliot smiled, his heart full. "She's the one making a difference, Michael. She's taught me a lot about seeing the world differently." Michael nodded, his expression thoughtful. "You're a humble man, Elliot. But I hope you know how much you're appreciated not just by Sophie, but by all the people whose lives you've touched." As Elliot drove home that night, he thought about Michael's words. He didn't consider himself extraordinary, but he couldn't deny the fulfillment he felt in his new role. Helping Sophie, connecting with her family, it had all reminded him of why he'd chosen a life of service in the first place. Months passed, and Elliot's life had settled into a rewarding new rhythm. His days driving the number 14 bus were as familiar as ever, but they now carried an extra layer of meaning. On his days off, or during quieter hours, he drove Sophie to her classes, doctor's appointments, and outings with friends. Elliot quickly became more than just a driver to Sophie. He was someone she could count on, a steady presence who treated her with the same respect and kindness he offered to everyone. For Sophie, Elliot's quiet encouragement was a reminder that her independence was something to be celebrated, not pitied. One chilly morning, Sophie asked him to take her to the park. It was her favorite spot for sketching, especially when the trees were bare and the world felt calm. Elliot wheeled her to her usual bench and watched as she pulled out her sketch pad, her face lighting up as she began to draw. "You know, Elliot," Sophie said after a while, her pencil pausing mid-stroke, "you've made a bigger impact on me than you realize." Elliot smiled, sitting on the bench beside her. "I think it's the other way around, Sophie. You've taught me a lot about resilience." Sophie tilted her head, her green eyes thoughtful. "Maybe we've helped each other, then. That's the best kind of teamwork, isn't it?" Elliot chuckled. "It sure is." As Sophie returned to her sketching, Elliot's phone buzzed with a text from Michael. "Thank you for taking Sophie out today. She hasn't stopped talking about how much she enjoys these outings. You've been a blessing to this family, Elliot." Elliot typed a quick reply, his chest swelling with a quiet pride. "It's my pleasure, Michael. She's a remarkable young woman." The relationship between Elliot and the Harts deepened as time went on. Sophie's confidence flourished, and Michael, ever grateful, often invited Elliot to join the family for dinner. At first, Elliot hesitated, unsure if he should cross the line between professional and personal. But over time, the dinners became a regular tradition, filled with laughter, stories, and a sense of belonging that Elliot hadn't realized he'd been missing. One evening, after a particularly lively dinner where Sophie proudly showed off her latest sketches, Michael pulled Elliot aside. "I've been thinking," Michael began, his tone measured. "You've become more than just Sophie's driver, Elliot. You've become part of this family." Elliot looked at him, his expression a mix of surprise and gratitude. Michael continued. "I want to make this arrangement more permanent. I'd like to offer you a full-time position driving for us, with flexible hours so you can still work your bus route if you'd like. The pay will reflect the value you've brought to Sophie's life and to mine. What do you think?" Elliot was taken aback. The offer was generous, almost too generous, and the sincerity in Michael's voice left no doubt about how much he appreciated Elliot's presence. "I don't know what to say," Elliot admitted. "Say yes," Michael said with a grin. "You've earned it." Elliot thought about the years he'd spent behind the wheel of the number 14, the countless lives he'd intersected with for fleeting moments. He loved his work, but this being part of Sophie's journey felt different. It felt lasting. After a moment, he extended his hand. "All right, Michael, I'd be honored." Michael shook his hand firmly, his smile broad. "Thank you, Elliot. I know this will make a difference for all of us." From that day on, Elliot embraced his dual role as both a beloved bus driver and a dedicated private driver for the Hart family. He continued to meet new passengers on his route, offering them the same kindness and care he always had, but he also found a deeper sense of purpose in his work with Sophie. Through her art, Sophie began to touch lives as well. She held her first gallery show later that year, with Elliot and Michael beaming in the front row. As people admired her vibrant sketches, Sophie made sure to give credit where it was due. "This one," she said, pointing to a drawing of a bus parked under a canopy of autumn trees, "is for Elliot. He taught me that every connection we make has the power to change us if we let it." Elliot's eyes glistened as he looked at the drawing. It was a simple reminder of the truth he'd always believed in, that kindness, no matter how small, could ripple outward in ways he could never predict. And as the applause filled the room, Elliot felt a quiet, unshakable joy. Life had led him to this moment not through grand gestures, but through the steady, humble acts that had always guided his path.